we are going to take a look at Principles by Ray Dalio. So, Ray Dalio's basic position is that you encounter certain situations that you're going to encounter repeatedly, and it's going to be another one of these, like he likes to call it. And because these situations pop up repeatedly, learning how to handle them really well is a good approach. And so, what he advocates is creating principles. Roughly speaking, the principles are both ways of thinking and also ways of acting. So, like, it's a way of looking at something, but also provides a heuristic for how to deal with it. His way of thinking is largely informed by evolutionary biology, in that he thinks that creating principles is an iterative process. So you create the principle, you apply the principle, you see the outcome, you refine it, and then you try it again, and then you refine it, and it gets better and better and better, presumably. Throughout the book, this is really refreshing. He emphasizes meritocracy a ton, and it informs all of his principles. His position, roughly speaking, in regards to business, is that the businesses that have the best principles are going to survive, and the other ones won't be able to compete. And so it'll be a survival of the fittest type of thing in the way that he frames it. He talks about competition quite a bit. The book is largely divided into three sections. There is his story of the founding of Bridgewater and the just general kind of Bridgewater story, his story, which is a very successful investment firm. Then there are his life principles, which are just general life principles. I'll give a couple examples in just a second. And then there's his business principles, which largely have to do with how to organize a corporate structure or how to run a business. It deals largely with one of the big things he really, really tries to push through is having the right people for the right positions. And so, an example of something he does is he has baseball cards. He thinks that certain people are certain ways. He really delves deep into personality tests, and he has at Bridgewater there are baseball cards for people where they have their strengths and weaknesses listed, and you can refer to the baseball cards, and it's a method of trying to make sure that you have the right people for the right job. Because that's one of his principles, have like the right people for the right job, and also try to have systems that are not biased in the same way humans are. And so when you have a rigorous rating system, then you have to make an argument against why you shouldn't have a particular person do a job if they have the better rating for it. Something to that effect. So some examples of his life principles. I'll just give some of the overarching ones. Embrace reality and deal with it, and then some subheadings. Be a hyper-realist. Be radically open-minded and radically transparent. An example of this is in his business principles, or the way he conducts his business, is that he films all of the meetings and he puts them up publicly, which has some liability concerns, because if you get caught saying something you shouldn't be saying, you could get fined. But he thinks that being transparent makes it worth it. Also, it's less likely he commits certain errors, or that was his position. It's less likely the company commits certain errors when they are that transparent. Pain plus reflection equals progress. And then another big overarching is use the 5-step process to get what you want. For this, he says have clear goals, identify and don't tolerate problems, diagnose problems to get at their root causes, design a plan, push through to completion. And then another big heading is be radically open-minded. Stuff like this. So, the business principles, each section of the book, it's somewhat interesting. If you, in the beginning of the first section, where he talks about Bridgewater, he actually suggests just skipping it. And the ratings I gave the book are informed by the assumption that you just skip the first section. But you can also skip the last section. If you wanted just the life principles, like if running a business is not something that you're concerned with, I would suggest just reading life principles, the middle third of the book. And that would be a pretty good way to try and squeeze as much utility out of the amount of time you're reading. So, the utility, I rated this book. Let's get to the ratings. I rated it an 8. I thought there was a lot of stuff that's very easy to implement and a lot of ways of thinking. Uh, what was particularly refreshing was Ray Dalio's repeated appeals and appeals to meritocracy. Almost all of the principles that he gives are really informed by this idea that you should aim to be meritocratic, and because of that, like it comes through on all the goals. That's why you have to be transparent, because if you're transparent and you also uh, live according to principles rather than some relational thing, like what you end up getting is you avoid nepotism a lot, because if it's clear who's the best for the job, because you're radically transparent, and your principle is put the person best in the job in the spot, then it becomes really hard to violate that or show favoritism, for example. So that was very refreshing. Also, the perspective of creating principles and being very aggressive about having heuristics for dealing with certain types of situations, I think conceptually is very interesting, even though throughout the book, the manifest content of the book is nothing that seems incredibly out there. It's nonetheless very a very refreshing perspective. Both operate from principles and the approach to meritocracy. For entertainment, I gave it a 4. Um, for utility, if you were to read the whole book, including the front half, I would maybe score it 1 lower. And for entertainment, if you were to do that, I would score it maybe half a point higher. Like the beginning's somewhat interesting. For interest, I gave it a 7. I thought that the different perspective was very interesting. Uh, Dalio seems pretty intent on avoiding bias and subjectivity, which is largely the reason for principles. And you have to. He advocates for an idea of meritocracy, and so if you want to deviate from the principles, you of course can, is part of what he says, but you have to have a really good reason. And so, if you don't have a really good reason, then the principles are what you go with. For novelty, I gave it a 7.5. I felt that this is largely because a lot of books that offer prescriptions on how to do things just kind of offer like a lot of studies and then like a lot of suggestions, and this is just complete like rehauling of the way you're looking at things, where it's kind of doing the same thing, but it's putting them all into principles. So he's citing like evidence for why these principles are good, but the principles framework is somewhat novel, and the degree to which he advocates for meritocracy, pretty like he's like fire your friends if you have to. Like he's very very clear that there's no reason to deviate from meritocracy. That is fairly novel and refreshing. For style, I gave it a 4. It seems like he wrote it himself. He's not a bad author, but it's not the style's not why you'd be reading it. For readability, I gave it an 8.5. The sections are very well formatted. The principles are well formatted. There's a ton of graphics inside of the book to make it easier to understand what he's talking about. The book's also just appealing, which makes it easier to read. For difficulty, I give it a 7. For the most part, he doesn't reference anything that's too difficult to understand. The degree to which it's not readable or maybe difficult is it kind of feels like a list at times, and so okay, that's kind of what it is. So it's not a narrative, so it's not going to feel like a narrative where there's flow or like some sort of dynamic narrative structure or anything like that. Overall, I liked the book quite a bit, so it got a score of 6.57. I would recommend this book to people who are specifically interested in business, people who have read evolutionary biology and liked it quite a bit. I think that this book would be interesting seeing a more applied section, or more applied way of thinking through like kind of the same lens. I would recommend this book um, to people who just want to read the middle third. I would recommend it pretty broadly. I would only recommend the back third and the front third to people who are particularly interested in business. Um, the book's also it's very I like it a lot. Just like the physical and the appearance of it. Um, I wouldn't. It can be a little dry, so I would not recommend it to anyone who primarily reads fiction or doesn't really like nonfiction. I wouldn't recommend it to someone who likes a lot of stylistic flourishes in their nonfiction or models that are like stylized. He's Dalio is pretty cut and dry, and so um, the book might not be interesting to you if you like a lot of spirituality books, for example, are like pretty flowery with the way that they describe things. Um, and if that's in your vein, then of like the types of things you like, then maybe this book would not be good. Um, if anyone particularly wants to go after the ideas of having just creating heuristics for the way you live your life or implementing meritocracy, I would also recommend it. But um, that's pretty much it. If you like the videos, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Um, if you don't like the videos, let me know why. That would actually be fantastic. Um, although, if you've listened to the end and not liked it, I would consider having a different strategy for a different principle, if you would, for how you decide to spend your time if you're watching a video you don't like all the way to the end. Anyways, thank you.